Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist and ghost lady of Pennsylvania, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you today?
Doing pretty good. It's a quiet, peaceful Sunday. We always shoot on Sundays for those that don't know that, and then put the stuff out in the next week. But it's a nice, quiet Sunday. A little chilly, but not too bad for March.
It's pretty warm, and looking at the long range forecast, I saw some sixes. So
Did you really?
I saw a number of sixes in a row. So yeah, that's I
Oh,
in the Fahrenheit world, that's a big deal when you're waiting for winter to be over. So if you haven't already subscribed, please consider subscribing. If you already are, thank you very much. And that's all I'm going to say about that. So everything else is in the description down of this episode. And since this is going to be part two of what we did last week, I don't even
yes.
have to ask what's our topic. So proceed, my dear.
So we are going to visit Ghosts of War again, and this I'm going to mostly feature World War I and World War II this time. There's a lot of stories that come out of there. The first one I wanted to share is about Fort Sill. Fort Sill's in Oklahoma, and it goes way back into the 1800s and the Native Americans and the military, confronting each other and what have you. So it has a long history. In fact, from what I understand, it's only like a mile and a half away from where Geronimo, I believe, is buried, and it's served many purposes throughout its history. So to give a little bit of history around it, during World War II, it was a training ground for military schools. The U.S. Army Field Artillery School was there. The United States Army Air Defense Artillery School was there. That was one of the 4 locations for the Army Basic Combat Training. And there are just a ton of stories around this facility, as you can well imagine. And people who have been stationed there, they tell a lot of stories about things that have happened at Fort Sill. The first one I wanted to share came actually from a KSWO TV channel,
Hmm.
and it was interesting. So they went there on Halloween. They sent a reporter out to the local, from the local station to interview for Halloween, and it was interesting because she said she was out there and she got some really cool stories. She was talking to the one of the people who worked at the Patriot Club bar, which of course is on the base there. She said that she works late at night and she'll hear the doors closing in the different buildings and stomping through the hallways and slamming. She said, I immediately will look out at the parking lot. There'll be no cars there, and yet the doors will swing open as though somebody's leaving. She doesn't really know what happened. She also talked about being working in Taylor Hall, which was a former hospital for the post. And she said, she's seen shadows walking through the building. They'll walk toward the front door, and then nobody ever goes out that door. She said there's no wind, there's no anything going on, and then everything will just fall off the shelves in that area as though somebody took their hand and swiped them off. And I thought that was really, kind of interesting. So it has a lot of history. Now, this next story actually came from a military officer, and he shared that when he was in Fort Sill, he was living in the senior quarters on the post, and when he was leaving in the morning, one morning for work, one of his neighbors at 5:30 in the morning, I can't imagine having to go through this with one of the neighbors. One of the neighbors came across the street and accosted him before he got into his vehicle and said, I want to know, why are there soldiers marching through our neighborhood at night? And he's like, what? There's no marching through the neighborhood at night. This is housing area. We wouldn't be marching soldiers through the housing area. And she's like, well, let me show you this. She pulls out her phone and she has a video of soldiers marching down the street right there where they're standing. And it's 2 columns of soldiers marching right down the middle of the road that goes to the local cemetery. And he said what he realized immediately was that these were antiqued uniforms. These were not normal modern uniforms. And he said, I asked her to send me the video, but her husband came and visited me later that day and told me that he should just forget the whole thing, that he was trying to be a first lieutenant and that he didn't want any kind of commotion, so he had his wife erase the video. And he said, but I'm telling you, this is what I saw. And I just thought that was an interesting thing. And I have to tell you, I'm a little sad that they got rid of the video, because that would have been fascinating to see. So
And for selfish reasons. I was in the Air
I've
Force
seen,
once, so I get it. Yeah.
yeah, I understand he didn't want anything to, like, cost him, because sometimes notoriety is not a good thing, but it is what it is. And, you just sort of have to go with it and then move on from there. But I thought it was an interesting story. So, and then I thought we would move on from that. So this story came, this next story is called The Phantom Invasion. And it came from, I want to make sure I give credit where credit's due. Bear with me. Haunted World War II's Top Weirdest Tales. So basically, the story is there's a gentleman who collects this kind of lore, and he's written a couple books on the subject, and he said that he thought he'd kind of covered it all, but he was doing a tour of some of the holiday sites that people go to. There's an entire group of people, not so much as now as used to be, but did a lot of the European war sites of World War II. A lot of times it was men going back to the places their dads had been or where they had been, and taking their family and telling them what it was like. And so he was doing that. He was going to some of these very famous sites and recording, stories and what have you from people who were there, who might have participated or their fathers had participated, things like that. And he gets to this one site, and it's, I believe it's pronounced Dieppe, D-I-E-P-P-E, Dieppe. And he said it was botched raid during World War II. And it was early in the morning hours of August the 4th, a few weeks before the anniversary of the raid, which is also known as Operation Jubilee. And he said that he was talking to a few people there, and all of a sudden they all heard the bark of cannons and the shouts and the screams of soldiers. The whole group of people turned and looked, and they saw what he calls a band of spirit brothers. And these people were moving along this area, and he said there was even air cover. You could see planes in the sky, and the witnesses said that you could, they all heard the screams of dive bombers and the planes and that horrible squeal that they give when they're headed to the ground, towards the ground. And he said, we, the vacationers, went out to investigate later in the morning and found no sign of any real incursion, and contacted the authorities and was told there were no reenactments, there was nothing. And he said, I came to record ghost stories, but I ended up participating in one. I can't imagine. That's a fascinating thing. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about ghost planes and, different things like that. So, and ghost ships and things like, there's all those cool stories, but I had come across one which is a ghost tank, and I wanted to share. So there were a group of witnesses who were on one of those tour areas where they were talking about this tank invasion and what have you on the Eastern Front. And they're just sort of like talking about the history and all of this. And then all of a sudden they said, witnesses told the local newspaper, I'm going to read this verbatim because it's from the paper, that one night while scouring the fields for artifacts from the war, a team of war trophy hunters distinctly heard the unmistakable clanking of steel treads and the roar of the engine cutting through the otherwise silent darkness. Too scared, the investigators stepped away from the area. And he said, I mean, who wants to run into a vaunted Soviet T-34 tank, or worse yet, the ghost of one? They did report what they found, and in the morning they went and looked. They found twin tracks of some type of vehicle on the ground, and the tracks were fresh. But the tracks, interestingly, started the middle of a field and end further down in the field, as though something literally materialized and then went away.
It's not like you're going to airlift a tank into the middle of a field. I think you would hear the helicopter.
Yeah, and I mean, that's insane, to think that. I will tell you, I've had a weird experience with tanks, but they were real. But they woke me up, and in the most unlikely of places. So at one point in my life, I lived in Old Bedford Village, and in the winter months, it's pretty much shut down after the first 2 weeks of December. And then if you live there, you're pretty much the only residents. There's like maybe 2 houses with people in it the entire winter. And this particular winter, there was 1 house with people, which was my family. So on a very cold December morning, late December, early January, I wake up and you can hear this loud piece of equipment, and I jump out of bed and I'm like, what is that? And it sounds like a war movie. And then you hear this whoa, boom, whoa, boom. And you're like, that sounds like a war movie. And like, I run up the stairs because my bedroom was on the first floor. My 2 sons, probably 12 and 14 at that point, are sitting by their window. And my one son grins at me and says, Mom, come look, the Germans arrived. And I'm like, what? And I look down, and in this beautiful French and Indian village, there are German tanks going along the dirt road, and off in the distance, American tanks. And I'm like, somebody rented the village for the weekend, and nobody told us. They didn't tell us we were going to be under attack from the Germans all weekend. So that was and then we ended up sitting there eating pancakes and watching the World War II panorama as we ate.
Okay, then. Where did they get the Tiger tanks from?
They came, so there's 3 places you can park at the village. And they parked on the far side of the village, not the back side where mostly reenactors park. I would have noticed them in the middle of the night, So what they did is they went in on the other end of the park, and they brought them on trucks.
Oh, okay. Right.
And, they offloaded them, and about right before dawn, they started some battle. And so we woke up to it.
Amazing that they would still be in operational condition. That's pretty good.
Through my time living there, I've seen World War II reenactments. I've seen Vietnam reenactments and equipment from both.
Mm-hmm.
Like, these people are serious, and some of them, believe it or not, I can't imagine who has that kind of money, but they buy multiple tanks from multiple wars, and they just restore them, and they do different types of reenactments. I met people that have done like 3 and 4 different historical types of reenactments.
Yeah, it's not like you can go to your local Army Navy surplus store and say, how many tanks you got?
Yep, but they find them and they redo them, and they work. So, but anyhow, I thought that was interesting. This next story comes from Vietnam, but not from Vietnam, but for a gentleman who was at Vietnam, I should say. The story is about told by his son, and he said after the Vietnam War was done, his dad got stationed at an Air Force base in Greenland, and he said they would often have these bad blizzards where when they came through, the whole base would get shut down, and every section of the barracks would have to take a roll call. And he said for 4 or 5 months while my dad was there, every time they got locked down for weather, they would hear this horrendous screaming outside. Everyone was accounted for, so they didn't risk sending anybody out to investigate. And they wrote it off as an animal, although I can't imagine what animal it would be in Greenland that would make that kind of a scream. He said, however, every time this was heard, the engine room would be wrecked. Tools would be everywhere, paperwork thrown all over the floors, the tables, the toolbox knocked over. Everything was just gone. Even one time, a several thousand-pound jet engine had been lifted from the workbench and smashed almost 30 feet away. He said the hangars in the engine room had cameras covering every single entrance to the area with spotlights that made it clear who or what was coming and going. There were no people ever seen. Nothing was ever found entering or leaving the buildings. And then one day, after about 5 months of this, it stopped.
Similar to other poltergeist kind
Yeah,
of
that's kind of what it
activity, but
reminded me of.
that's
Yeah. So, I just thought it was really interesting. So then here's another one also post right around the Vietnam War. So this was the Jungle Warfare Training Center. And this gentleman wrote, he said, whenever I was in the Jungle Warfare Training Center, there was blood-curdling screams that were heard in the middle of the night. We thought at first, because we were just young soldiers, that our commanders were messing with us, trying to scare us and make us, look stupid. And he said, but it always sounded very much like a woman. And one day, we heard the screaming, and the lieutenant in charge of us made us do a quick accountability check. And then he started radioing the training center to see what was going on. The instructors came out from their compound and did checks, but could not find anything. They said this is not the first time that units that were stationed there reported hearing the woman's horrifying screams. This went on all the time. No one was ever seen. And then this is another one who talked about his drill sergeant in Afghanistan. He said, my drill sergeant had been in one of the Afghanistan deployments. He was an infantryman, and on one of his missions in the field, he was out for multiple weeks. This wasn't uncommon. And one night while they were sleeping in fighting position, he was dug in and he felt something nibbling at his feet. He woke up and kicked it off. And then when he looked down at it, it wasn't a marsupial or anything like that, but a little humanoid figure. He could only describe it as looking like a golem. But being in the field with little sleep, he chalked it up to seeing things. However, a couple days later, he and another guy were on watch, and the other guy pointed out something and said, "What the F is that?" and pointed at the stone wall in the distance. And my drill sergeant looked through the binoculars, expecting to see a person crawling across the wall. Instead, on the stone wall was the exact same little humanoid figure he had encountered a few nights before. He didn't say a word. He handed the binoculars to the other man, and he reported seeing exactly the same thing. I thought that was really interesting. And a golem, by the way, for those who don't know, is kind of a demonic entity, comes out of Jewish folklore. It's usually made of mud and animated through almost a tulpa-like procedure. And I've never heard of them being very small. I've always heard of them being very large. So I found this one a little interesting. But they're definitely part of Jewish folklore if anybody wants to look into it. Another one that I thought was really interesting was this one. So back in 2012, this gentleman says he was lucky enough to be a private in the military. And one night they were in Afghanistan, as they were stationed in Afghanistan, they got this weird transmission over the radios. It was pretty strong. We couldn't determine what was being said, but it was odd. Now, I'm not a linguist, but I know enough different languages to know straight up it was Russian. We had a recording device and managed to catch most of the broadcast before it stopped. We didn't have any Russian linguists with us, but we sent the copy of the recording stateside and got information translated. I know that one of the warrant officers in my unit was also a Russian linguist back in the Cold War era. And he listened as well. He said he was rusty, but got the gist of the message. And it was a distress call crying for help. Their base was being overrun and they were being attacked by the Afghanis. But this would have happened at least a dozen years earlier. So intercepting calls that, don't make any sense. So I wanted to go backward a little bit and go to World War I. I found a ton of stories from World War I, more so even than World War II, although there are some stories from that. And I know the one story I have talked about somewhere in the depths of the past, but I'm going to tell the story again because it is so fascinating. And if you can't visit the ghosts of war without kind of hitting this story, it's one of those types of stories. So during World War I, it was the years of 1914 to 1918. So it was a 4-year spread. The Allies, just for everybody to know who was who, were eventually would be the Russian Empire, the French Third Republic, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and the United States, Japan, and Italy. The enemy, or the Axis or Central Powers, were the German Empire, the Austrian, Hungarians, and the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria. So that's kind of who the players were. Now, there is a battle called the Battle of the Mons in Belgium. It took place in 1914. It was a really, really bloody battle. The British forces met the advancing German First Army, and it was a horrendous battle on the French border. And at first the enemy got driven back a little bit, but then the Germans managed to start forcing the British back, and they were trying to hold on, and they couldn't. This is August of 1914. Now, the death toll was extremely high. The Germans just literally were overwhelming the Allied forces at this battle. And the British decided that they had to retreat. They had to move back. They had to keep going. And that's when everything changes. So this is firsthand accounts coming from people who were at the battle, and they were interviewed later. So the English soldiers claimed that mysterious apparitions began to appear to them over the battlefield as they were trying to figure out how to, retreat and not be decimated, because the Germans knew they had them on the run, and the Germans were fierce soldiers. And so they knew they were going to take heavy losses. And then out of nowhere, in the middle of the battlefield, come these entities. The surreal, ghostly entities were variously described as angels or bowmen, or even St. George himself or St. Michael holding a great glowing sword. And in one case, a small unit said they saw Joan of Arc, and they descended down out of the sky between the retreating British and the Germans. And they stopped the Germans. Like, they were literally fighting the Germans and holding them at bay. And I can't imagine the Germans were not rattled as well, because they were seeing it too. They were literally fighting these beings. And the descriptions varied, from some soldiers swearing they saw literal angels prowling along through the gloom and the smoke of the battle, others saying that mighty, colossal, angelic beings loomed over and surveyed them from the mountains, that others saw roving bright lights, but all who saw these mysterious apparitions credited them with the survival of the British troops. One retreating British unit claimed that they had been joined by a spectral army of bowmen, who were described as looking as they came from the time 500 years ago in France, and that they lashed back and forth with a rain of shadowy arrows upon the Germans, and even claimed that German prisoners would later corroborate that they had surrendered due to the bowmen who had shot at them. They were shocked by the ancient warriors and dressed in armor. Hundreds of dead Germans were allegedly found strewn about the battlefield with no physical wounds, and people were wondering if some sort of gas had been used, because there were no injuries, but they were dead. Another report told of giant winged entities that bloomed out of the smoke to frighten the Germans away. One report was relayed to a nurse who was caring for an injured corporal. And this is what the gentleman told the nurse. He said, "In mid-air, a strange light suddenly appeared, which was quite distinctly outlined and was not a reflection of the moon or the clouds. The light became brighter, and I could see distinctly 3 shapes, one in the center having what looked like outspread wings. The other 2 were not so large, but were quite plainly distinct from the center one. They were above the German line and facing us. We stood watching them for 3/4 of an hour." Think about that, 45 minutes. "All the men with me saw them. I have a record of 15 years good service, and I should be very sorry to make a fool of myself by telling stories to please others. I am telling you what I truly saw." Lost soldiers would later tell stories of glowing angels, male or female, dressed in white gowns, who took their hands or shone their light and led them the way back to safety. Others talked about a strange amorphous set of clouds that flickered light and spread out to block the retreat of the enemy and spooked the horses of the cavalry, sending them into flight. In most cases, the light-bathed beings fanned out and chased the German army in some fashion. Many captured Germans later allegedly concurred something strange had been going on, reporting seeing entities themselves and claiming they were unable to be shot or killed with conventional weapons. They were seen by many as a sign from God, a heavenly sent force to save them from the darkness of defeat. I don't know how you get past that.
No, and looking at it would make you say that, right, so if you got these divine entities assisting us, we must be in the right.
Now, that's actually an argument for why it might have been propaganda, except that there are individual accounts written in letters to family members and things like that that have turned up. So I can see where you might, like, there's no doubt in my mind that the government, every government uses propaganda, and they'll do whatever they have to. And if you think that that God's divinely supporting your interventions, you might be more willing to continue. But in this instance, it's not just newspaper accounts. It's actual letters written from to family members back home and things like that.
Well, I was also thinking the converse too. The on the German side might make you question: are you really doing the right thing?
Yep, I agree. It's not an unusual thing. I'm going to give a couple more instances. So there's a gentleman by the name of James Wentworth Day, who in 1954 wrote a book called Here Are Ghosts and Witches. Now, in this book, he talks about November of 1918 in Flanders. It's Belial, Flanders. And he says that he and others witnessed a corporal, and he names one of them as a Corporal Jacques Barre. They saw spectral French and German soldiers atop a hillside, seeming to reenact a World War II cavalry battle that actually occurred in 1914. So it's 4 years later. They're, still fighting, and they noticed this. They said, although the entire event was violent, there was no noise, no sound, and no one seemed to harm each other. They just kept going at each other. When locals were asked about the incident, they said that each year at the time of the battle, of the original battle, the spectral forces would come out and do battle and then vanish for another year. So this is kind of an anniversary haunting. And he happened to be on that battlefield at the time. Now, before we leave Mons completely, there's a couple other things I'd like to share. So there was two British soldiers who were dying in the muddy muck of the Battle of the Marne. And they claimed that they were wounded and helpless, that they spied a ghostly form of an old woman dressed in a bonnet and a blue bright skirt, stalking along and always seeming to wander right into the line of fire. At first, they thought that they were kind of hallucinating, because everything looked so surreal. And then a third soldier ran into the area and paused. They had to pull him down. He seemed so shocked. He was standing upright. Not a good position in the middle of a battle. And he was crying when they got him to the ground. And he said, why is my mother here? My dead mother. I don't understand what she's doing here. And suddenly he calmed down. He got dead still, and he said, she's come to take me home. I know she has. And in that moment, he was blown up. Now, had the two other men not seen that, it would never have been a story. But he would actually write a letter. The one gentleman would write a letter home and talk about this, and then later on shared it in his book. Also printed in the Liverpool Echo, which was a newspaper of the time, was a sighting made by an entire company of officers on the battlefield. The officers in question had been badly injured from a grenade blast in a prior battle, including both of his arms being blown off his body, and he died, obviously, on the battlefield. So they're now fighting in it's trench warfare. It's horrible. And suddenly, out of nowhere, this officer suddenly appears, and the men in the trenches see him. He's standing there and he's yelling and giving orders. And when the battle's over, this one gentleman says to the colonel, he said, "Did you see him? Did you see him?" And the guy said to him, "You mean our old colonel?" And he says, "Yes." He said, "He was standing down there." And he said, "Yeah, I saw him for a full minute. I know I saw him, but he could not be here. He couldn't have been." But other men came forward and said they saw our old colonel too. And then this gentleman I was talking to looked at me and said, "Do you know what was really amazing?" And I asked him what. He said, "Our colonel still had both his arms." I thought that was so amazing. There's another story that came in a letter from a soldier to his mother at home. His mother was alive, so this is really interesting to me. The soldier would write to his mother that she had saved his life, and he asked her to continue to watch over him. He claimed that in the battle, his mother appeared and beckoned to him to follow her. He stumbled in her direction and she kept ahead of him, just beckoning him to keep going. At some point, he saw this blown up, shelled out house and he was exhausted and he laid down inside this house and she said, "Pause and rest, my son, rest." And he said, "I closed my eyes thinking my mother was still here, not even able to realize if she were, she might be dead." And when he awoke, she was gone. And he went back to his unit, stumbled back to his unit in the trenches, and they were completely gone. All that was left was a big hole where they had been. They were all missing. They ended up, he finds out later, they were blown up. And he said in this letter to his mother that he hoped that she would come again and keep him safe throughout the war. But what an interesting story.
I don't think it actually was his mother. It was probably some other type of entity, just
Or a doppelganger or whatever. I don't know.
Mhm.
But it's an interesting story nonetheless. And there are lots of stories of stuff like that over the course of time. You see them, through every battle, every war that's ever existed. Often in the opposite, for example, there are stories of soldiers who have appeared at the foot of their mother's bed or their wife's bed and said, "I need to tell you goodbye," or "I just wanted to tell you I love you." And then they look at the clock or they notice something and they find out in the morning that that person had died right around that time. There's a lot of that. And just tons of those stories. So we're going to move to April of 1917. The 42nd Battalion of the Canadian Black Watch. There was a gentleman by the name of Corporal Will Bird. He had fallen asleep. It was, horrible. He was on something called Vimy Ridge, and it was in a dugout area in France. And during the battle, the Canadians and the Germans were fighting each other, and he woke up to the feeling of gentle hands shaking him. He thought at first it was one of the guys from his unit shaking him to wake him up. And instead, when he rolled over and opened his eyes, it was his brother Stephen, who had died while serving the Canadian forces 2 years earlier. And his brother urgently beckoned him to come with him. "Come, you need to leave." And he said, "I followed the apparition over the scorched, bombed out moonscape of no man's land until we reached the husk of a destroyed building on the fringes of the battlefield. My brother pointed, and I thought he wanted me to sit down, and then he disappeared into thin air. I was scared. I was puzzled. I was exhausted. I did not have any inclination to make my way back until hours later. And when I got back to my group, I found that there was a bombed out shell where the dugout had been, and all the men had been dismembered beyond recognition. Not one of them survived except for me. That is because I hadn't been there. I had been led into the gloom away from the danger by my brother." He would later write a book in which he shared this story. The book is called "Ghosts Have Warm Hands." So obviously this was an event that truly touched his life. Another story from World War I that I found fascinating is this took place in Turkey in 1915. It was August of that year. The 5th British Norfolk Regiment was moving through that region, fighting in a military campaign. The soldiers were mostly from the estate of King Edward VII, and they were led by a guy who in his private life had been a land agent by the name of Frank Beck. The veterans would claim that between 6 and 8 loaf-shaped clouds descended over the soldiers during the battle, which hovered over the troops before producing a fog, which the battalion marched right into, and they never emerged from the other side, with strange objects then rising into the sky to apparently take the whole contingent of 100 men with them. The Turkish authorities later claimed that they had nothing to do with the disappearance or the fate of these men. To this day, what happened to these men is unknown. Thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, time slip or something like that they walked into.
Or, yeah, well, I mean, like, that's
Mhm.
exactly what they did. Half a dozen or so loaf-shaped clouds. Could that
Mhm.
be UFOs?
Maybe.
You know, there are stories
Who
about
knows?
phantom battalions, coming out of nowhere. I had told a story from last week about in Gettysburg. There was a story about a group of soldiers who had marched into a fog and didn't come out the other side. And the reenactors or the actors for the movie Gettysburg were there, and they witnessed it and were absolutely shocked because they saw them coming. These people, they weren't part of the actors. They kind of interfered with the recording, and they come out of nowhere. They literally go into this little valley that's kind of early in the morning. It's got a lot of fog in it. They march into the fog. They don't come out the other side. There's actors on the other side who they ask about it. They said, no, nobody came through that little valley toward us. So are they still marching there? I don't know. And one of the other things, and anybody who's ever heard of the Red Baron, I think right now, honestly, most people don't have the faintest clue what the Red Baron is except for pizza.
I have seen his grave in Wiesbaden, Germany.
Oh, yeah, he was quite, he was the
Richthofen.
German ace
Mhm.
pilot.
Mhm.
He was probably one of the best pilots
Mhm.
during that time frame. He had 80 air combat victories. That means 80 planes shot down. And what people don't know is that there's a book out there it's called UFOs of First World War by Nigel Watson. I'm trying to give these titles, so if you want to look them up, if you can't get them because they're not active titles, you can probably find them in a PDF through the Library of Congress. Anyhow, in this book, he tells this story that it was 1917. They were in the trenches of Belgium, and the Red Baron was flying over that region. He and another pilot by the name of Peter Waitsrick, and the Red Baron spotted an unidentified object that he described as an upside-down silver saucer with orange lights hovering in the clear blue sky. After a moment of awe and fear, the Red Baron put it in his sights and shot it at it. Waitsrick reported later that he saw the whole thing, and he described it as this is his words. We were terrified because we had never seen anything like it before. The Baron immediately opened fire, and the thing went down like a rock, shearing off tree limbs as it crashed to the woods. It gets even weirder still. As we passed over the wreckage, 2 humanoid figures seemed to climb out of this wreckage and hurried into the tree line, after which we could not see them again. Waitsrick would keep this whole bizarre story to himself until he was an elderly gentleman. In 1999, before he passed away, he shared it with a local newspaper. Quite an interesting story. So another baffling story from the time period took place in January of 1918 in France. And this is Lieutenant Frederick Ardsley. He was patrolling in the north of France. As he flew along, and another biplane comes up, same make, same model, and it positions itself right beside him. And when he looks over, expecting to see another soldier, another pilot in the cockpit, this is what he saw. He said he saw a beautiful woman with long, flowing blonde hair. She blew him a kiss, and I don't know how this is even possible, but kicked her leg up as if to do a can-can dance in her cockpit before swiftly flying away. Ardsley attempted to chase this pilot, but she reportedly outmaneuvered him, and he lost her. Unbelievably, the mystery woman would show up at other times during the war and engage German pilots who she easily eluded them, and she would shoot them down. And she seemed impervious to bullets when they got her in their sights. And then she would just, if you shot at her, she vanished into thin air. She became known as the Lady Sopwith, or the Valkyrie, and became a legend. No one knows who she was, if she was alive, or if she's just a myth. But this was told on both sides of the war. I thought this was a fascinating story. I did. There's just some amazing stories about World War I. Now I'm going to end with this story. I think this is fascinating. It's not necessarily a ghost story, but it's a weird story. So there was this dude by the name of Ed Salinger, who was an officer in the OSS, which is the precursor to the CIA. Now, during World War II, he came up with this bizarre way to screw with the Japanese. He wanted to he had lived in Japan, so he knew they had like all these folk legends and they were very superstitious and what have you. So he creates this thing called Operation Fantasia. And what he wanted to do is to catch these foxes, paint them with to a luminescent dye of some sort, and he wanted to release them in Japan so that they would fulfill the story of this demonic fox entity that the Japanese had in folklore. And he thought that this would unnerve them and make them understand that they were fighting on the wrong side, and the demons, these fox demons, had come out to come after them. And it sounds really ridiculous, except he tried it. So they actually painted these foxes with like a phosphorescent gas and lithium. And unfortunately, it washes off if you put them in the water to get them on the island. You can't parachute a fox in. The fox doesn't know what to do. So it became a real problem. And yep, it poisons the animals. I know it would definitely do that.
Oh yeah, and you mix lithium with water, it bursts into flame.
Exactly. So then he decided to build a fox out of a taxidermied fox and put a human head on it that could move. But it looked really doofus-like, and it was it was weird. And you could tell it was fake. So that one didn't go. So now, not to be put off, he decided that they would focus on the Japanese fox spirit and a spirit of doom called the Kitsune. And so he continued to work on this project. He created whistles that sounded like the call of the damned, as it's described in the folklore, and a spray that smelled like a fox, so that you could actually kind of create some of the whole ambiance. Now, when he first starts this, he takes the real foxes covered in this dye, this lithium stuff, and releases them in the forest down around Washington, D.C., freaking out the local people for weeks. But it doesn't ever go to any, it doesn't ever work. It's really hard to believe that they spent a couple years and if you want to know where your money's going, people, things like this, even back then. Eventually, they gathered 30 foxes They decked them out with radioactive glowing paint and in 1945 released them in Washington, D.C. in Rock Creek Park. And then eventually they realized there's no way to get the foxes there. They can't make the foxes show up to see the people. There's nothing about it that makes any sense. And then finally, after a couple years of this, they finally decide to stop funding Operation Fantasia. However, I want to add one last little thing. Not to not be outdone, the OSS came up with some other amazing stories. For example, did you know that they tried to poison Adolf Hitler's food with female sex hormones so that his mustache would fall out? They thought that would humiliate the Führer.
Yeah, that was a face palm.
Yep.
Wow.
So I told you some ghost stories and I shared some of the craziest crap I've ever heard. And they tried to create a haunted ghost fox and cause poor old Adolf Hitler to lose his mustache. And with that weirdness at the end of this particular podcast, I wish everybody a wonderful evening. I hope we ended on a humorous note just because some of those stories are pretty dark. Good night.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is there going to be a part 3? But I guess not.
Well, I mean, like I have another 80 pages of this stuff. I can come back to it, and if people want, they can write in and text us and let us know they'd like to hear more of this stuff, because there are literally tons of these stories. It's just insane how many of these stories there were. I didn't even work hard at it, and I ended up with 190 pages.
All right. Well, good night.
Good night.